So I thought I would end our official lecture. The second lecture for this week will actually be guided by a discussion that I'll be having with my community TAs, and so that'll be the next thing that we'll move on to for this week. But for the last part of today's lecture, I wanted to move on to the modest little topic of the meaning of life and see whether we could draw some connection with self-knowledge and that issue. And for that, because there's some subtlety there, I thought I would read from a text that I prepared for the day rather than extemporize as I've usually been doing. So the idea of the meaning of life is at once mysterious and attractive. It's attractive because we feel on some level that if we knew what it was, we would finally know what to do with ourselves, and we could stop bickering about whether this or that activity, such as making money or helping others, union with a higher being, or meditation, is worth our while. But the idea of the meaning of life is also mysterious. We have no idea what it would be like to open up a box of some kind and see, gleaming within it, an authoritative answer to the question, what is the meaning of life? After all, any scenario in which we imagine opening a very special box and finding such a message purporting to express life's meaning is just one in which we'd probably find ourselves thinking, well, that's what you say about the meaning of life, what life's meaning is, but I'm not so into that myself. That's not what gives life meaning for me. You say the meaning of life, for example, is loving your neighbor, but I say it's the Norwegian death metal band called Zyklon B. Bummer. End of quotation. As a philosopher, however, it's my occupational hazard and obligation to obsessively ask and reply to things people say two questions. One, what do you mean? And B, how do you know? My students here at the university know how to just say, recite in their sleep. What do you mean? How do you know? We can only make progress on the second question, how do you know, after making some progress on the first, some headway on the first. So let me try to do that with our question of the moment. If a politician starts talking about, for example, the will of the Armenian people, I'm inclined to wonder what justifies his use of that little word, the. It's the most common word in English, maybe even in many other languages, and yet it packs a lot of information. As the philosopher Bertrand Russell once realized nearly over a century ago, a sentence using the word the, presupposes that there's at least one, as well as at most one thing answering a certain description. As a result, a politician referring to the will of the Armenian people makes me wonder, well, how do you know that there's at least one such thing, and how do you know that there's at most one such thing? Maybe there are as many wills as there are voters, with hardly a generalization to be made. So too, the phrase, the meaning of life, presupposes that life has at least one and at most one meaning. But we shouldn't accept either assumption blithely. After all, if the school of philosophy known as existentialism is right, then life has no meaning at all, and we are simply collocations of particles floating around in an indifferent universe. In a spirit following that of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, the most we can do is to create meaning for ourselves rather than discover it. At the same time, a pluralist about meaning might suggest that there is no reason to suppose that life has at most one meaning. For all we know, maybe there are 11 things that count as life's meanings, just as there may be as many wills as there are voters. Now to all that you might reply, look, okay, fair enough, but I'll settle for just one thing here. Let me know one thing that gives life meaning, and I'll take it from there. That'll be enough for me to get started to find meaning in life. And part of what spurs your anxiety, perhaps, might be the following. We strive and struggle and hurry and fret, take tests, grow up, get jobs, buy things, pay taxes, raise families, and so on. And yet in the end, everything looks like it's going to turn to dust. So much toing and froing, and yet within a few billion years our sun will turn into a red giant and destroy the solar system. Or maybe we'll trash our planet, destroy our planet and all life forms on it before we figure out how to get ourselves to another location that will support life. Either way, the prognosis for genuine permanence is not particularly good, and even if it were permanent, one might still worry about the Buddhist notion of suffering due to conditions. Given all that, you might feel that if only you could be sure of at least one thing that would give life meaning, the fleetingness of our lives and of humanity more generally would be perhaps a little bit easier to take. Well, someone might reply to that, right, this is where my faith comes in. What gives meaning to my life is hope for a better place elsewhere, and even for eternity. But if your life would be without meaning if it were finite, how would getting as it were, a backstage pass to a place that would enable you to go on indefinitely, infinitely even, make it meaningful? It's not as if we suppose that the only good, for example, rock and roll bands are the ones that play forever. Rock concerts will be wonderful even when they're over. Why should we think that the only worthwhile lives are those that go on forever as well? Well, if meaning doesn't come from eternity, where might it come from instead? My middle name is Shepherd, after my great-granduncle Shepsy, who died at the hands of the Nazis. He had been training to be a rabbi when he was packed into a cattle car and sent to a concentration camp. I sometimes wonder what went through his mind in his last moments in the gas chamber as he asphyxiated on, this time the real, Zyklon B. Did he feel his life had been pointless? I hope not. I hope that he might have had an inkling that perhaps part of what gave his life value was that he had been striving to do something that rightly mattered to him, even though he apparently did not achieve his aim. I carry around in me the legacy of a forebear who was murdered for his heritage as well as for his values. Now, I switched a moment ago from speaking of meaning to speaking of value, and this switch was intentional. In lieu of an oracle, such as the one at Delphi, who can tell us that life has at least one meaning and what that meaning or those meanings are, I suggest that a better route might be to consider how we might find value in some of the things that we do. Here I'm speaking of intrinsic value rather than instrumental value. These are technical terms. Let me try to explain them. Most of us, although maybe not all, of us value money, for example, instrumentally, in that we care about what it can get us and not as an end in itself. Some things that money can get us and some things that money can't get us are valuable in a different way, and let's call that intrinsically valuable. Intrinsically valuable is that different way from extrinsically or instrumentally. Walking along the beach with my daughter and my dog Clementine, as I did last summer, seeing wild dolphins frolic in the sea was valuable for its own sake and not because of any good that came of it. Teaching my students here at the university, as well as around the world, in some sense my students, but only in some sense, teaching students here as well as around the world and doing my research brings in a paycheck, but that's not why I do these things. I do them because I care about helping others to cultivate their minds and more broadly themselves. These things are intrinsically valuable to me. To take the step from value to meaning, I might note that someone might find something intrinsically valuable even when it seems, to the rest of us at least, kind of meaningless. George might find intrinsic worth in collecting string. Susan might be really into spelling words backwards every time she hears people speak. Both activities seem kind of pointless to us, like, for example, Sisyphus pushing his boulder up the hill. What George and Susan seem to be missing is some reflection on whether these things are things they should care about. I'm now suggesting that what might take us from things that we find valuable, even intrinsically valuable, to things that are meaningful is a process of reflecting on whether the things we do value for their own sake are things that we would value in that way, all things considered, after collecting a reasonable variety of experience and after engaging in a certain amount of self-inquiry, achieving a certain amount of self-understanding. So Socrates, remember, said that the unexamined life is not worth living. I find this dictum as it stands kind of high-handed. I mean, after all, remember, he's telling me that people who don't engage in self-examination live worthless lives. That seems kind of rich. Fortunately, as we know, Professor Richard Crowd has taught us that there's textual evidence to read that dictum as saying that the unexamined life is not to be lived. Not that your life is worthless if you don't engage in self-examination, but that you're missing something if you fail to engage in self-examination. Your life still might be worth living if you don't examine it, but you're probably missing something of value. And what I'm now suggesting is that if you don't ask yourself now or sometime whether the things you do care about are things you should care about, you might be in danger of missing out on a lot of meaning. Now, suppose that George, our friend George, who likes collecting string, on reflection says that string in its kaleidoscope of colors and textures is just beautiful to behold and lovely to collect. Then I say, so be it. Collecting string can give his life meaning. I think it's a little odd, but he might think that I'm kind of odd for spending endless hours reading and writing books and yammering away to my students. Susan, at least, makes it a little more interesting by using all those words backwards. But the three of us could actually make peace with each other, I want to suggest. For I'm suggesting that what gives life meaning is not something external, shimmering on top of a tall mountain. Rather, it seems to me, it's inside of you. But that's not to say it's always the first thing that comes to mind when you achieve a kind of self-knowledge or self-understanding. You might intrinsically value something for reasons that, on reflection, turn out to be kind of flimsy. A life devoted to pursuing such ends, valuing things that do not admit of being holding continued value on further self-examination, that might make life, if not meaningless, then less meaningful than it could possibly be for you. Self-examination is a good rule of thumb because it increases the chances that the things that you land on as intrinsically valuable are things that are worth valuing. So you find things out about yourself, and then you're in a position now to ask yourself, are these things that I just realized I do care about? Are they things that I should continue to care about? Are they things that I should allow to be what guides my life for the rest of the life that I've got? And you might find that maybe they aren't. And so things that you find are among what you intrinsically value are not necessarily things that are primarily what gives your life meaning. So there's this ability to transform what matters to you by means of that process of self-awareness, self-understanding. So as you continue through life, be it terrifying, grotesque, beautiful, and occasionally sublime, I want to urge you to ask yourself, of the things that you value, which are the ones that you'd continue to value, even on careful reflection? And if you feel that your range of experience is too narrow to answer that question reliably, then I suggest widen that range of experience and try sometime later. Things might look different from Norway or other parts of the world, different styles of life, different ways of approaching living. I want to suggest try those different vantage points, try those different perspectives, such as is within your abilities, capacities, and resources, and see whether that multi-perspective view on your life would allow you to, as it were, loosen your grasp in the way that Herigel needs to loosen his grasp naturally on the arrow, so too allowing yourself to loosen the grasp on certain things that you say matter to you, that you say are absolutely imperative to your happiness. You might begin to wonder whether those things absolutely are. So again, big picture now. We've talked a lot about the nature of self-knowledge, its various aspects, its various forms, its limitations, the ways in which we engage sometimes in self-deception as well. And in spite of all that, it seems to me a certain amount of self-knowledge is capable of being achieved. A certain amount of increase for at least most of us is something that we're capable of achieving. But that does not guarantee that once you achieve self-knowledge, you will thereby find meaning or find happiness. It might be that self-knowledge is a good first step, but what you find out when you pull back the curtain is not something that you're entirely happy with. We go from self-knowledge to something more like meaning in life, it seems to me, by asking yourselves, are the things that I care about, are they things that I should care about? That on reflection, as I get more experience, as I talk to other people and get different points of view, as I get a sort of multi-perspective view on my own life, will I still continue to find those things valuable? If so, I say more power to you. If not, then the possibility of self-transformation by means of exercise of freedom of will presents itself as an option that could increase value if it's something that you think merits increase in your own life.